Look at this specimen. Strong, healthy, and ready for any task you set before her. Only 3,500.
What Romans did to the wives of defeated warriors was not just cruel, it was worse than death itself. Imagine this for a moment. You are a princess, the daughter of a proud chieftain. The men of your tribe have just fallen in battle, your husband among them. Smoke rises over your homeland. And then, instead of a quick end, chains are clamped around your wrists. Your fate is not to join your loved ones in an honorable death. No, Rome has something far darker planned. The Romans were not satisfied with simply defeating enemies in battle. Their real power came after the fighting stopped. For the women of conquered peoples, survival meant entering a new kind of prison: slavery. When Roman soldiers stormed through a defeated city, the first thing they did was seize the survivors. Women and children were lined up, bound together, and dragged away like spoils of war. They were property, now living trophies of Rome's victory. A noblewoman, once seated on a throne, could be sold at a marketplace like cattle. Her name, her title, her freedom, all erased in a single moment. Families were torn apart deliberately. A mother might watch helplessly as her son was sold to labor in the deadly mines of Spain, her daughter taken by a different master to serve in a wealthy household, while she herself was sent to toil on a distant farm. The separation was permanent. The Romans knew this shattered not only bodies, but spirits. It destroyed the very roots of a people's future. But the cruelty did not stop there. Enslaved women lived with constant fear of abuse. They had no protection under Roman law, no right to say no. A mistress in a Roman villa might be forced into concubinage or worse, and any children born of such unions would inherit the chains of their mother, born as slaves, never free, their native bloodlines erased over generations. For the Romans, this wasn't just victory, it was domination, a way of ensuring that conquered peoples would never rise again. For the women, it was a living nightmare, one that stripped away not only their freedom, but their very identity. If enslavement was meant to strip conquered women of their identity, public humiliation was designed to crush their dignity in front of the world. No spectacle captured this better than the Roman triumph. Picture the scene. Rome is celebrating a great victory. Streets are overflowing with citizens, cheering wildly, throwing flowers, and chanting the name of their victorious general. Golden chariots roll forward, glittering with spoils stolen from distant lands, treasures, statues, sacred relics. But behind the riches come the real trophies, the prisoners. And among them, the women. Captured queens, princesses, and noble wives were forced to march at the very front of the procession, on display like exotic animals. They were dressed not in royal garments, but in rags. Some were shackled at the neck, others bound at the wrists. Their tears, their defiance, their very humiliation became part of the entertainment. The Roman crowd laughed, jeered, and mocked. What once commanded respect in their homeland was now paraded as weakness. The triumph of Aemilius Paulus after the conquest of Macedon gives us a chilling example. The wife and daughters of King Perseus were dragged through Rome in chains. These women, who had once lived in palaces, now stumbled barefoot on rough cobblestones, forced to bow before their conquerors. The sight of defeated royalty weeping in despair was meant to burn one message into every Roman mind. Rome was invincible, and no one, not even the wives of kings, was beyond its reach. But humiliation didn't end with the march. Many of these women were destined to be executed once the spectacle was over. Some were strangled in the prison beneath the Capitoline Hill. Others, if lucky, were sold into lifelong slavery. The triumph was not just a parade, it was a ritual of psychological warfare. It told every nation watching, this is what happens when you defy Rome. Even for those women spared execution, the shame of the triumph never disappeared. They were remembered not as queens or leaders, but as captives broken before the Roman mob. Their downfall was woven into the story of Rome's glory. To Rome, this was power at its most theatrical. To the women, it was degradation so public, so total, that death may have seemed kinder. Rome conquered with swords, But it also conquered with silence, the kind of silence that history books often avoid. Beyond the battlefields and triumph parades, another form of domination awaited: captured women. Sexual exploitation. For many enslaved women, their bodies became part of the spoils of war. Roman generals and soldiers treated them as rewards, trophies to flaunt and abuse. A noble woman, once a symbol of dignity and authority in her homeland, could be reduced overnight to a concubine or a bed slave, stripped of choice and forced into submission. Unlike the grand, public humiliation of triumph processions, this weapon worked in the shadows. It was intimate, invisible to the crowds, but no less brutal. In Roman households, enslaved women could not refuse advances from their masters. In fact, sexual access to slaves was seen as a man's right. If the woman bore children, those children were also enslaved, further enriching the master's household. The cycle was endless, and escape was almost impossible. The silence around this exploitation was deliberate. Rome prided itself on its discipline, its laws, its order. But when it came to the conquered, the rules shifted. The abuse of women became a form of political theatre in private. Another reminder that Rome held absolute control not just over lands and armies, but over flesh and blood. Some women, however, turned survival into resistance. Ancient whispers tell of captives who used their position as concubines or slaves to influence their masters, to secure freedom for their children, or to secretly pass information to enemies of Rome. These acts rarely made it into official records, but they existed, proof that even in degradation, women could wield quiet power. Yet for most, there was no escape. Sexual exploitation was not written into triumph speeches or carved into monuments, but it was there, in the shadows of the villas, in the silence of the night, in the private lives of generals who celebrated victories by breaking the women they had conquered. This was Rome's silent weapon, a weapon that left no battlefield markers, but scars that stretched across generations. A weapon that proved Rome's power was not only about killing armies, but about erasing dignity, rewriting womanhood itself. When Rome conquered, it didn't just take lives or lands, it turned people into entertainment. For captured women, one of the darkest fates was being thrown into the arena. Here, survival was not about freedom, it was about feeding the bloodlust of thousands. Most people imagine gladiators as men, but history records gladiatresses, female gladiators. While rare, they were deliberately used as a spectacle, a way to shock and excite the Roman crowds. Imagine the humiliation. A noble woman, once a wife of a respected warrior or chieftain, forced to fight half-naked under the blazing sun of the Colosseum, jeered at by tens of thousands. Some were pitted against wild beasts in staged hunts, venationes, where survival was nearly impossible. Others were forced to duel each other, with Roman audiences mocking their screams and struggles. For the Romans, it wasn't just about sport, it was about symbolism. Women of defeated nations became literal playthings, reminders that Rome's domination extended into every corner of life, including gender roles. The cruelty was layered. These women weren't trained fighters, most had no chance of survival. The fights were designed to be one-sided, to highlight Roman power while reducing the captives to disposable bodies. Even if a woman managed to survive one fight, the emperor or crowd could demand another, until exhaustion or death claimed her. One recorded case mentions Emperor Domitian staging shows where women fought dwarfs, an intentionally degrading mismatch crafted for laughs. For the audience, it was comedy. For the women, it was hell. But within this cruelty, a strange contradiction appeared. Some women gladiators earned a twisted form of fame. Their faces appeared in graffiti, their names whispered in taverns. They became curiosities, symbols of both Rome's cruelty and Rome's fascination with breaking boundaries. Yet, this fame was not freedom, it was still captivity, dressed up as spectacle. For the wives of defeated warriors, this was psychological devastation. To be reduced from a respected matron or queen to a bloodied figure in the sand was not just defeat, it was erasure. Rome didn't just want to beat its enemies, It wanted to break their spirit, to turn their suffering into a carnival. In the arena, women's dignity was consumed for cheers. Their pain became applause. And Rome's message was clear. Even the wives and daughters of kings were nothing more than fuel for its endless hunger for power and spectacle. If the arena was one stage of humiliation, the Roman triumph was another, perhaps even worse. A triumph was the highest honor a Roman general could achieve. A grand parade through the streets of Rome, celebrating victory. But for the defeated, especially women, it was the ultimate act of degradation. Picture the scene, the streets overflowing with citizens, cheering, laughing, and throwing flowers. At the front of the procession, carts overflowed with stolen treasures, gold, jewels, sacred statues ripped from temples. Behind them came the chained prisoners, the defeated king, his warriors, and, most heartbreakingly, their wives and children. These women, once queens and noble wives, were stripped of their dignity. Chained, dressed in rags, and paraded like animals, they were displayed as living trophies. Rome wanted its citizens to see that even the proudest enemies now walked as slaves. The psychological cruelty was immense. Many were forced to watch their husbands and sons dragged beside them, only to be executed at the end of the parade. The infamous Mamertine prison, where prominent captives were ritually strangled, became the final stop for kings and generals. Wives had to witness it all, unable to intervene. Take the case of King Jugurtha of Numidia. Betrayed and captured, he was paraded in Gaius Marius's triumph in 104 BC. His wives and children almost certainly walked behind him, helpless, knowing their fate was lifelong slavery. Or think of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, a woman who once ruled an empire in the east. After her defeat in 274 AD, she was dragged through the streets of Rome in chains of gold. Though spared execution, she lived the rest of her life as a captive, her throne forever lost. For the Romans, this was not just celebration, it was psychological warfare. By humiliating the wives of leaders, Rome destroyed hope in the hearts of the conquered. The message was clear: resist Rome, and not only will you die, but your family will be paraded as proof of your failure. To the watching crowds, it was spectacle. To the women, it was worse than death. Their very identities, queen, wife, mother, were shattered in front of the world. Rome celebrated, they mourned. And with every cheer, the chains around them grew heavier. For many ancient warrior cultures, death in battle was the highest honor. To die with a sword in hand meant glory, remembrance, and peace in the afterlife. But for the wives of defeated warriors, survival was not a gift, it was a curse. Rome made sure to stretch out for the rest of their lives. Why was it considered worse than death? First, there was the loss of honor. In Celtic, Germanic, and other tribal societies, a woman's honor was tied to her freedom, her family, and her role in preserving lineage. Enslavement stripped away all three. To be sold as property, sometimes branded like cattle, was the ultimate humiliation. Second, there was the erasure of legacy. Death allowed a family line to end with dignity, but slavery ensured that future generations were born into chains. Any children forced upon enslaved women by Roman masters would never carry their ancestors' names. Instead, they became Romans' property, their true heritage erased forever. In the eyes of these cultures, that was a spiritual death far crueler than a sword strike. Third, there was the loss of the afterlife itself. Many ancient peoples believed proper burial rites were essential for the soul's rest. To be enslaved, dying far from home, without rituals or remembrance, meant wandering eternally. This belief made captivity a kind of spiritual imprisonment beyond death. Finally, there was the living torment. Every day, these women were reminded of what they had lost: their families, their freedom, their dignity. The labor was exhausting, the punishments harsh, and the abuse relentless. Unlike a quick death on the battlefield, enslavement was a slow, grinding destruction of the self. Roman historian Tacitus once wrote of conquered peoples, "They make a desert and call it peace." For the wives of defeated warriors, Rome didn't just make a desert of their homeland, it made a desert of their lives. To the outside world, they were survivors. But to themselves, they were living ghosts, stripped of everything that gave life meaning. Death could have brought an end. Instead, Rome forced them to live on, as shadows of the people they once were. And that is why, for these women, survival under Rome was not a victory, it was a punishment worse than death itself.